Imagine a nation wiped off the map, their holiest temple reduced to rubble, their people scattered across an empire. Dead, finished, game over. But then something impossible happens. A foreign emperor declares their resurrection. 70 years of exile end with a single decree. Thousands risk everything to rebuild what was lost, but the enemies are waiting. Political schemes, construction sabotage, and spiritual compromise threaten to destroy the dream before it begins. Welcome to the Book of Ezra, where comeback meets controversy, where faith faces opposition, and where the most shocking reformation in history unfolds. This isn't the Sunday school version. This is Ezra raw, real and revolutionary. Ready to see it like never before? The year was 538 BC, and something extraordinary was about to happen. King Cyrus of Persia had just conquered Babylon, the mighty empire that had destroyed Jerusalem and taken God's people as prisoners. But instead of continuing the cycle of oppression, this foreign king was about to make a decision that would change everything. What Cyrus didn't know was that God had already spoken about him by name through the prophet Isaiah, 150 years before he was even born. Isaiah had called him God's shepherd and anointed one. Now, as recorded in the first chapter of Ezra, verse 1 tells us that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. This wasn't political calculation or military strategy. This was divine intervention working through a pagan ruler's heart. The proclamation that followed would echo throughout his entire kingdom. As chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 record, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. And let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place, with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem." This wasn't just a permission slip. This was a royal command, backed by imperial resources. A foreign king was ordering the rebuilding of the Jewish temple and funding it with his own treasury. But Cyrus did something even more remarkable. 70 years earlier, when Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem, he had taken all the precious items from Solomon's temple, the gold bowls, silver dishes, and sacred vessels that had been used in worship for centuries. These treasures had been sitting in Babylon's pagan temples dedicated to false gods. Now, as chapter 1, verse 7 tells us, King Cyrus brought these out and gave them to Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. The list that follows in verses 8 through 11 is staggering. 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. Think about what this meant. Every cup, every plate, every sacred tool that had been stolen was now being returned. These weren't just religious artifacts. They were symbols of God's promises. For 70 years, the Jewish people had wondered if God had forgotten them. Now, every returned vessel was proof that he remembers everything. Sheshbazzar, who is also called Zerubbabel, carefully received each item. The treasurer counted them out one by one, making sure nothing was lost. After decades of exile, the sacred vessels were finally going home. Among all the people preparing for this historic journey, one man stood out as the natural leader. Chapter 2, verse 2, introduces us to the key figures. The number of the men of the people of Israel, the sons of Parosh, 2,172, the sons of Shephatiah, 372. But before listing all these families, it mentions the leaders, and first among them is Zerubbabel. This wasn't just any refugee choosing to return home. Zerubbabel was the grandson of King Jehoiakim, the last king of Judah before the exile. Royal blood flowed through his veins, but more importantly, he had been chosen by God to lead this massive undertaking. The Persian Empire was giving him official authority as governor, but his real power came from something deeper. The people recognized in him both the dignity of David's lineage and the wisdom needed for such a dangerous mission. Leading nearly 50,000 people across 900 miles of desert with treasure and livestock while rebuilding a destroyed city, this required someone special. Zerubbabel didn't seek this role for personal glory. He understood that he was carrying the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders. Every family looking to him for direction, every priest depending on his decisions, every child whose future hung in the balance, they were all his responsibility now. What happened next was remarkable in its detail and organization. Chapter 2 gives us an incredibly precise record of exactly who was returning. This wasn't a chaotic exodus, it was a carefully planned restoration. The numbers tell an amazing story. As verse 64 records, the whole assembly together was 42,360. But this wasn't just a head count. Each family was listed by name, each profession was documented, each town of origin was remembered. Look at some of these families mentioned in verses 3 through 20. The sons of Parosh, 2,172. The sons of Shephatiah, 372. The sons of Arah, 775. The sons of Pahath Moab, namely the sons of Jeshua and Joab, 2,112. The sons of Elam, 1,254. The sons of Zatu, 945. The sons of Zakkai, 760. The sons of Bani, 642. Each number represented real people with real names, real families, real dreams of home. Some families were large, others small. Some had maintained their wealth during exile, others had lost everything. But they all shared the same hope, to see Jerusalem rebuilt. The priests are listed in verses 36 through 39. The priests, the sons of Jediah, of the house of Jeshua, 973. The sons of Immer, 1,052. The sons of Pashur, 1,247. The sons of Harim, 1,017. Even the temple singers and gatekeepers are carefully counted in verses 41 and 42. This wasn't just paperwork. This was a declaration that every person mattered, every family had value, and everyone had a role to play in rebuilding their nation. But not everything went smoothly during this registration process. A serious problem emerged that would affect the spiritual leadership of the restored community. Some men claimed to be priests, but they couldn't prove it. Chapter 2, verses 61 and 62 explain the situation. And of the sons of the priests, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Hakkoz, and the sons of Barzillai, who had taken a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was called by their name. These sought their registration among those enrolled in the genealogies, but they were not found there, so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. During the 70 years of exile, some records had been lost. Some families had intermarried and taken new names. The man called Barzillai had even adopted his wife's family name, instead of keeping his priestly identity. Now, when it came time to serve in the temple again, they couldn't prove who they really were. This created a real dilemma. Verse 63 tells us what the governor decided. The governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until there should be a priest to consult the Urim and Thummim. They would have to wait until God could reveal the truth about their heritage through the sacred lots used by the high priest. This wasn't about being harsh or unwelcoming. The priesthood carried serious responsibilities, and only those truly called by God could handle the sacred duties. It was better to be careful than to risk dishonoring God's service. The detailed record continues with something that might seem unimportant, but actually reveals how thorough this restoration was. Chapter 2, verses 65 through 67, carefully list everyone and everything making the journey. Besides their male and female servants, of whom there were 7,137, and they had 200 male and female singers. Their horses were 736, their mules were 245, their camels were 435, and their donkeys were 6,720. Why would the Bible bother to count the animals? Because this journey wasn't just about getting people from point A to point B. This was about rebuilding an entire civilization. The horses would provide transportation and communication. The mules would carry heavy loads through mountain passes. The camels would survive the desert crossings. The donkeys would do the daily work of construction and farming. Even the 7,837 servants weren't forgotten in this count. These weren't slaves being dragged along against their will. Many of them had chosen to stay with Jewish families during the exile, and now they were choosing to make this dangerous journey together. They had become part of the community. The 200 singers mentioned here would have a special role in the restored temple worship. Music had always been central to Jewish faith, and these men and women would help bring joy and praise back to Jerusalem's streets. Every person and every animal represented hope for the future. This wasn't just an escape from Babylon. It was the foundation for rebuilding everything they had lost. As the great journey was being organized, something beautiful began to happen. Wealthy families started opening their treasuries to fund the restoration. Chapter 2, verses 68 and 69 record this generous response. Some of the heads of families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made free will offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 darics of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priests' garments. These weren't required taxes or forced contributions. These were free will offerings, gifts given from the heart because people believed in what God was doing. The amounts were staggering. 61,000 darics of gold would be worth millions in today's money. 5,000 minas of silver represented years of wages for ordinary workers. But notice they also gave 100 priests' garments. These weren't just valuable clothes. They were the special robes needed for temple service. Someone had carefully preserved these sacred garments through 70 years of exile, waiting for the day when priests could wear them again in Jerusalem. The phrase, according to their ability, is important. Not everyone could give gold and silver, but everyone could give something. Some gave from great wealth, others from modest savings. What mattered wasn't the amount, it was the heart behind the gift. These offerings weren't just funding a building project. They were investments in hope, declarations of faith that God would indeed restore what had been destroyed. Every coin donated was a vote of confidence in God's promises. When this massive group finally reached the Promised Land, they faced a crucial decision. Where would they live? They could have all stayed together for safety and community. Instead, they did something that showed incredible faith and wisdom. Chapter 2, verse 70 simply states, "Now the priests, the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all the rest of Israel in their towns." But this brief statement represents a massive undertaking. These families weren't just moving to random locations. They were returning to their ancestral cities, the same places their great-grandfathers had lived before the exile. After 70 years, they were reclaiming their inheritance, town by town, village by village. Think about what this required. These cities had been destroyed or abandoned. Wild animals might have moved in. Other peoples might have settled there. The wells might be clogged, the houses in ruins, the fields overgrown. But family by family, they began the work of restoration. The priests went to the priestly cities. The Levites settled in their designated towns. Each tribe and family group returned to their traditional homeland. It was like watching a scattered jigsaw puzzle reassemble itself, piece by piece. This settlement pattern wasn't just about real estate. It was about restoring the social and spiritual structure that God had originally designed for His people. Each town would have its own leadership, its own character, its own role in the larger community. By the 7th month, as the final verse suggests, everyone had found their place. The great return was complete, and the real work of rebuilding could begin. When the 7th month arrived, something remarkable happened. The scattered families who had settled in their ancestral towns all came together in Jerusalem with one purpose. Chapter 3, verse 1 tells us, "When the 7th month came, and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem." This gathering wasn't planned by human organizers. It was a natural movement of hearts, all pulled toward the same goal. From every corner of Judah, families packed their belongings and made the journey to Jerusalem. Some walked for days from distant towns, but they all arrived with the same burning desire to restore their worship. What they did next reveals their priorities in a way that still amazes people today. Before building houses for themselves, before constructing walls for protection, before even laying the foundation of the temple, they built an altar. Chapter 3, verses 2 and 3 explain, "Then arose Jeshua the son of Jozadak with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel with his kinsmen. And they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation, for they were in fear of the peoples of the lands, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord. Morning and evening, Jeshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor worked side by side. Spiritual and civil leadership united in this sacred task. They didn't debate about it or form committees to study the idea. They simply began gathering stones and building according to the exact specifications Moses had given centuries earlier. Think about this decision. They were surrounded by hostile neighbors who watched their every move. They had no walls, no temple, no defenses. Wild animals roamed the ruins of the city at night. Bandits could attack at any moment. But their first act was to worship God. Even though they were afraid of the people living around them, they chose to put God first. The altar wasn't just a religious symbol, it was a declaration of war against fear. It announced to everyone watching that these returned exiles were serious about their faith. Every morning and evening, sacrifice sent smoke rising toward heaven, visible for miles around. It was their way of saying, "We're back, and we're here to serve the living God." The smell of burning offerings filled the air twice daily, reminding everyone in Jerusalem that God was once again receiving worship in his chosen city. The priests resumed their ancient duties with joy, wearing the sacred garments that had been donated for this purpose. The altar was just the beginning of their grand plan. As chapter 3, verses 4 through 6 describe, they began celebrating all the festivals that had been forgotten during the exile. And they kept the Feast of Booths, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule, as each day required, and after that the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon and at all the appointed feasts of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord from the first day of the 7th month. They began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. Picture the excitement as families built temporary shelters throughout Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths. Children who had been born in Babylon experienced these celebrations for the first time on their ancestral soil. Elderly people wept as they remembered festivals from their youth, now restored in the very city where they belonged. But even while they celebrated, they were planning something much bigger. Chapter 3, verse 7 describes how they organized the massive temple construction project. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea to Joppa. According to the grant that they had from Cyrus, king of Persia, this was exactly how Solomon had built the original temple hundreds of years earlier. The same Lebanese cedar, the same skilled craftsmen, the same trade routes. They weren't just rebuilding, they were restoring the original design that God had blessed. Ships arrived at the port of Joppa loaded with massive cedar logs. their resin filling the air with the sweet smell of Lebanon's forests. The construction began in earnest during the second year. As verse 8 tells us, "Now in the second year after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. Every family contributed according to their ability. Men who had been farmers learned masonry. Merchants organized supply chains. Women prepared food for the workers. Children carried water and tools. The entire community became a construction crew with one shared dream. When the foundation was finally completed, the celebration was unlike anything Jerusalem had seen in decades. Chapter 3, verses 10 and 11 paint the scene. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. The priests wore their finest ceremonial robes, the ones that had been carefully preserved through 70 years of exile. The trumpets gleamed in the sunlight as their clear notes rang across the construction site. The cymbals crashed in rhythm as hundreds of voices joined the ancient songs that David had written for temple worship. The music filled the air as hundreds of voices joined together in worship. Trumpets and cymbals created a joyful noise that could be heard throughout the city. But then something unexpected happened that made the celebration even more meaningful. The sound of celebration suddenly became more complex and deeply moving. Chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, reveal why. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. The older men in the crowd had lived through the destruction of Solomon's temple. They remembered its massive size, its incredible beauty, its golden walls that reflected the morning sun like fire. They had seen the massive bronze pillars at the entrance, each one tall as a 6-story building. They remembered the sea of bronze that could hold thousands of gallons of water, supported by 12 bronze oxen. They had witnessed the glory of God filling that temple so powerfully that the priests couldn't even stand to minister. Now, as they looked at this new foundation, they realized it would never match the grandeur of what they had lost. This temple would be smaller, simpler, built with much more limited resources. The gold and silver that once covered every surface would be replaced with plain stone and basic wood. But their tears weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of memory mixed with overwhelming gratitude. Yes, this temple would be smaller and simpler, but it was still God's house, and it was rising from the ashes of destruction. Sometimes the most powerful emotions come when loss and hope meet in the same moment. These elderly men understood something profound. God's presence doesn't depend on the size of the building, but on the hearts of the people who worship there. The younger people shouted with pure joy because this was the first temple they would ever see. For them, it represented nothing but promise and possibility. They had heard stories of Solomon's temple, but this one would be theirs. They would see it completed, serve in it, bring their children to worship there. The sound of their celebration, mixed with the weeping of their elders, created a noise so powerful that people heard it from miles away. Travelers on distant roads stopped and wondered what could create such an incredible sound. Even the enemies watching from nearby hills could hear this mixed chorus of joy and tears echoing across the landscape. Chapter 3, verse 13 emphasizes this. Remarkable detail. The sound was heard far away. This wasn't just a local celebration. It was an announcement to the entire region that God's people were back and his house was rising again. The sound of that celebration reached the wrong ears. Chapter 4, verse 1 introduces a new problem that would change everything. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." These weren't Jewish people offering to help. These were the mixed populations that the Assyrian Empire had settled in the land after they had deported the northern kingdom of Israel over a century earlier. When the Assyrians conquered a territory, they had a policy of moving people from different regions to prevent rebellions. So these neighbors were descendants of foreigners who had been brought from distant lands and settled in Samaria and the surrounding areas. Over the years, these settlers had adopted some Jewish religious practices, learning about the God of Israel from the few Jewish people who had remained in the land. They had even begun offering sacrifices, claiming to worship the same God, but they also continued worshiping the gods they had brought from their homelands, creating a mixed religion that combined truth with error. Their offer sounded reasonable and friendly on the surface. Who wouldn't want extra help with such a massive construction project? They claimed to worship the same God and even said they had been offering sacrifices for generations. They had money, workers, and political connections that could make the temple construction much easier and faster. But Zerubbabel and the other leaders sensed something wrong with this proposal. They had learned from their ancestors' mistakes. The original kingdom of Israel had fallen partly because of compromising alliances and mixed worship. These leaders weren't going to repeat those errors. No matter how attractive the offer seemed, the response in chapter 4, verse 3 was firm but polite. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." This wasn't about being unfriendly or exclusive. This was about spiritual integrity and obedience to God's commands. God had called his people to rebuild the temple according to his specifications, with pure worship and undivided hearts. Accepting help from people who mixed the worship of the true God with pagan practices would compromise everything they were trying to restore. When their offer of help was rejected, these neighbors revealed their true intentions. The mask of friendship fell away, and what lay underneath was much darker. Chapter 4, verse 4 describes what happened next. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. All the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. This wasn't random opposition. This was organized psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the Jewish builders. They began spreading fear among the workers, telling them that the project was doomed to fail. They whispered that the Persian government would change its mind and punish everyone involved in the construction. They planted doubts about whether God really wanted them to rebuild the temple, but they didn't stop with local intimidation. They hired professional lobbyists and political advisors to work against the Jews in the Persian court. These were experts in palace politics who knew how to influence government officials and delay projects through bureaucratic red tape. Money changed hands as bribes were paid to anyone who might be able to slow down or stop the temple construction. Day after day, year after year, these opponents kept up their campaign of discouragement. Every time the Jews made progress, someone would appear with a new reason why they should stop. Every time they gained momentum, a fresh wave of threats and warnings would slow them down. Workers would arrive at the construction site only to be told that new regulations made their work illegal. Suppliers would suddenly raise their prices or refuse to deliver materials. The phrase, "all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia," means this went on for years. Cyrus had given them permission to build, but he was busy running a massive empire and couldn't stop every local official from making their lives difficult. The opposition was patient, persistent, and well-funded. They understood that they didn't need to win a single dramatic victory. They just needed to make the project so difficult and discouraging that the Jews would eventually give up. The Jewish builders found themselves looking over their shoulders constantly, wondering when the next obstacle would appear. Construction slowed as fear began to replace the joy they had felt during the foundation ceremony. Some workers began to wonder if maybe their opponents were right, maybe this whole project was a mistake. The situation became much worse when Cyrus died and the Persian throne changed hands. Political upheaval in the empire created new opportunities for the enemies of the Jews. But the real crisis came when a king named Artaxerxes took power, and these opponents saw their chance for a decisive blow. Chapter 4, verses 6 through 16, describe a formal legal attack on the temple project that was far more dangerous than anything they had tried before. The enemies wrote an official letter of accusation. As verse 6 mentions, "And in the reign of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and Mithridath and Tabeel and the rest of their associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia." The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. This wasn't a casual complaint, this was a formal, diplomatic document written in the official language of the Persian government and carefully translated to ensure the king would understand every word. The letter was signed by multiple officials, giving it weight and credibility. These weren't random troublemakers. These were people with official positions and political influence. They presented themselves as loyal servants of the Persian Empire who were concerned about a growing threat to imperial security. Their accusations were serious and carefully calculated. "Be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired." Notice how cleverly they twisted the truth. The Jews weren't rebuilding the city walls, they were building the temple. But by calling Jerusalem rebellious and wicked, they made it sound like the Jews were planning a revolt against Persian authority. They claimed the king would lose tax revenue, appealing directly to his financial interests and making the issue seem like a threat to the entire empire. The letter continued with a warning that seemed reasonable and patriotic. "Now, because we eat the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king, in order that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. You will find in the book of the records and learn that this city is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, and that sedition was stirred up in it from of old. That was why this city was laid waste." By saying they eat the salt of the palace, they were using a Persian expression that meant they were loyal servants of the king. They claimed they couldn't stand by and watch the king be dishonored by allowing this dangerous situation to continue. Then they made a brilliant move. They asked the king to check his own records to verify their claims. King Artaxerxes took these accusations seriously. When you're running an empire that stretches from India to Ethiopia, you can't ignore reports of potential rebellions. Chapter 4, verses 17 through 20, record his thorough response. The king sent an answer. To Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and in the rest of the province beyond the river, greeting. And now the letter that you sent to us has been plainly read before me. And I made a decree, and search has been made. And it has been found that this city from of old has risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition have been made in it. And mighty kings have been over Jerusalem, who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. The king didn't just take their word for it, he ordered a complete investigation. Persian record-keeping was incredibly detailed, and the royal archives contained documents going back hundreds of years. When his scribes searched through these records, they found exactly what the accusers had predicted they would find. Jerusalem had indeed rebelled against previous empires. Kings like Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the city precisely because of such rebellions. The record showed that Jerusalem had been a major power center in the region, with kings who had controlled vast territories and collected taxes from many provinces. From a purely political perspective, the accusation seemed completely valid. The king's research revealed that Jerusalem had been destroyed because it was rebellious and wicked. The records documented multiple instances of sedition and revolt. Any reasonable ruler reading this information would conclude that rebuilding Jerusalem was indeed a serious threat to imperial security. But the king went further than just investigating the claims. Chapter 4, verse 21 continues his decree. Therefore make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that this city be not rebuilt until a decree is made by me. And take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? This wasn't just a temporary pause. This was an official imperial command to stop all construction immediately. The letter gave local authorities full power to enforce this decree with whatever force was necessary. The final question, why should damage grow to the hurt of the king, made it clear that anyone who allowed the work to continue would be held personally responsible for any problems that resulted. The king's decree was absolute and final. There would be no appeals, no negotiations, no exceptions. The work must stop, and it must stop now. The response was swift and devastating. Chapter 4, verses 23 and 24 describe what happened when the letter arrived. Then, when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe and their associates, they went in haste to the Jews at Jerusalem, and by force and power made them cease. Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. The enemies didn't waste any time celebrating their victory. Armed with royal authority and probably accompanied by Persian soldiers, they marched to Jerusalem and forcibly shut down the construction site. The phrase, by force and power, suggests they may have used violence or threats of violence to stop the work. Workers who resisted were probably arrested or beaten. Imagine the scene that day. Workers who had been laying stones and cutting timber suddenly found themselves ordered to put down their tools by armed officials. The sound of hammers and saws that had filled the air for months fell silent in a matter of hours. The temple site, which had been bustling with activity and hope, became an abandoned construction zone almost overnight. The precious cedar wood from Lebanon was left to weather the storms. The carefully cut stones sat in piles, gathering dust and weeds. The foundation that had been celebrated with such joy became a monument to broken dreams and frustrated hopes. Children who had grown up, watching the temple rise, now played among the abandoned tools and materials. The community that had been united around this great project suddenly found itself scattered and demoralized. Some families began to wonder if they had made a mistake in returning to Jerusalem. Others questioned whether God really intended for them to rebuild the temple. The enemies had achieved something that military force alone could never have accomplished. They had broken the spirit of God's people. For 15 long years, the work remained stopped. 15 years of waiting, wondering, and watching the half-finished foundation weather the storms. The early enthusiasm that had carried them through the first challenges had been crushed by legal maneuvering and political pressure. The joy that had mixed with tears during the foundation ceremony became just a memory of better days. But this wasn't the end of the story, though the people couldn't know that yet. God's plans cannot be stopped forever by human opposition, even when that opposition comes with imperial authority and legal documents. Sometimes God allows his people to experience setbacks and delays to prepare them for something even greater than what they originally imagined. For 15 long years, the temple foundation had sat unfinished. Weeds grew between the stones, and rain had weathered the exposed surfaces. The people had grown comfortable with their unfinished project, focusing on their own houses while God's house remained in ruins. Then something extraordinary happened that changed everything. Chapter 5, verse 1, records the moment when heaven broke through the silence. Now the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Two men, called by God at exactly the same time, began declaring messages that set hearts on fire. Haggai was an older prophet who may have remembered the first temple. His words were direct and challenging, asking the people hard questions about their priorities. Zechariah was younger, filled with visions and dreams of what God wanted to accomplish. These weren't just religious teachers giving gentle encouragement. These were prophets speaking with divine authority, carrying messages straight from the throne of God. When they opened their mouths, the very words of the Almighty came forth with power that penetrated hearts and stirred consciences. Haggai's message was especially pointed. He asked the people why they lived in fancy houses while God's house lay in ruins. He connected their economic struggles to their spiritual neglect, showing them that their prosperity was linked to their obedience. His words cut through 15 years of excuses and compromise. Zechariah brought a different but equally powerful message. He spoke of visions filled with hope and promise. He saw golden lampstands and flying scrolls, mysterious horsemen and triumphant kings. His prophecies painted pictures of a glorious future that could only come through completing the work God had started. Both prophets spoke with such authority and clarity that people couldn't ignore their words. After years of spiritual dryness, the community suddenly found itself face to face with the living God again. The prophetic fire that had been absent for so long was burning bright in Jerusalem once more. The impact was immediate and undeniable. People who had grown comfortable with the status quo suddenly felt deeply uncomfortable with leaving God's work unfinished. Families who had focused entirely on their own prosperity began to see how empty their success felt without God's blessing. The prophetic messages hit their target with perfect accuracy. The two most important leaders in the community felt the word of God pierce their hearts like arrows. Chapter 5, verse 2 captures their immediate response. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak arose and began to build the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. Zerubbabel the governor and Jeshua the high priest didn't call committee meetings or form study groups to discuss the prophetic messages. They didn't wait for permission from the Persian authorities or worry about the legal consequences. They simply got up and started building. Their response was swift, decisive, and united. This is what real spiritual leadership looks like. When God speaks clearly through his prophets, godly leaders don't hesitate or make excuses. They act. Zerubbabel could have worried about his political position as governor. Jeshua could have been concerned about his religious responsibilities. Instead, both men recognized that obeying God was more important than avoiding problems with people. The phrase "arose and began to build" shows their determination. They didn't just talk about rebuilding, they picked up tools and started working. They gathered the people, organized the labor, and resumed the construction that had been stopped for 15 years. The sound of hammers and saws once again filled the air around the temple site. But notice something important. The prophets of God were with them, supporting them. Haggai and Zechariah didn't just deliver their messages and disappear. They stayed involved, encouraging the workers and providing ongoing spiritual guidance. This wasn't just a construction project, it was a spiritual movement with prophetic leadership. The combination was powerful. Zerubbabel provided political authority and organizational skills. Jeshua brought religious legitimacy and spiritual oversight. Haggai and Zechariah offered divine revelation and prophetic encouragement. Together, they formed a leadership team that could handle both the practical and spiritual challenges of completing the temple. Word spread quickly through Jerusalem and the surrounding towns. The project that everyone thought was dead was suddenly alive again. Workers who had abandoned their tools 15 years earlier found themselves drawn back to the construction site. The dream that had been crushed by political opposition was rising from the ashes with new life and energy. The renewed construction activity didn't go unnoticed by Persian officials. Chapter 5, verse 3 introduces us to a man who would play a crucial role in the next phase of the story. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: "Who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish this structure?" Tattenai was the regional governor responsible for all the territories west of the Euphrates River. His jurisdiction included Jerusalem, and anything happening in his territory was his responsibility. When reports reached him about unauthorized construction in Jerusalem, he had to investigate. His job depended on maintaining order and ensuring that imperial law was followed. But notice something important about Tattenai's approach. He didn't arrive with soldiers to shut down the work immediately. He didn't arrest the leaders or destroy what had been built. Instead, he came with questions, seeking to understand what was happening before taking action. This was very different from the hostile approach that had stopped the work 15 years earlier. Chapter 5, verse 4 continues the conversation. They also asked them this: "What are the names of the men who are constructing this building?" Tattenai wanted a complete list of everyone involved in the project. This wasn't necessarily threatening, it was standard administrative procedure. Any official investigation would require knowing exactly who was responsible for the work. The Jewish leaders could have panicked at this point. After all, they had restarted construction without getting new permission from the current king. They were technically violating the decree that had stopped their work 15 years earlier. They could have stopped building and tried to negotiate, or they could have ignored the governor's questions and hoped he would go away. Instead, they did something remarkable. Chapter 5, verse 5 tells us, "But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned concerning this matter." The Jewish leaders answered Tattenai's questions honestly and completely. They told him about Cyrus's original decree and their authorization to rebuild the temple. They explained their history and their purpose. Most importantly, they kept working while they talked. They didn't let fear stop their progress. Tattenai's response was surprisingly reasonable. Instead of shutting down the work immediately, he decided to investigate their claims before taking action. This was either divine providence or exceptional wisdom, probably both. Tattenai faced a difficult situation. The Jews claimed they had legitimate authority to build, but the previous decree from Artaxerxes had clearly stopped all construction. Rather than make a decision that might anger the king either way, he chose to seek guidance from the highest authority. Chapter 5, verses 6 and 7 describe his solution. This is a copy of the letter that Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and his associates, the governors who were in the province beyond the river, sent to Darius the king. They sent him a report in which was written as follows. This letter was a masterpiece of diplomatic writing. Tattenai presented the facts objectively, without taking sides or making recommendations. He simply told the king what he had found and asked for instructions on how to proceed. The letter begins in verses 8 and 9. To Darius the king, all peace. Be it known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being built with huge stones, and timber is being laid in the walls. This work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. Notice how Tattenai described what he saw. He called it the house of the great God, showing respect for the Jewish faith. He mentioned that the work was being done with huge stones, indicating quality construction. Most importantly, he observed that this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands, suggesting that God was blessing the project. The letter continues in verses 10 through 11 with the questions he had asked. Then we asked those elders and spoke to them thus: "Who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish this structure?" But we also asked them their names for your information, so that we might write down the names of their leaders. Tattenai had done his job thoroughly. He had asked the right questions and gathered all the necessary information. He wasn't trying to protect the Jews or attack them. He was simply presenting the facts and letting the king decide. Then came the crucial part of the letter, recorded in verses 12 through 16, and this was their reply to us: "We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our fathers had angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, Cyrus the king made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt." The Jewish leaders had given Tattenai a complete history lesson. They explained how the original temple had been built by Solomon, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar because of their ancestors' sins, and authorized for rebuilding by Cyrus. They didn't try to hide their past or make excuses for their ancestors' failures. The letter concludes in verse 17 with Tattenai's request: "Therefore, if it seems good to the king, let search be made in the royal archives there in Babylon to see whether a decree was issued by Cyrus the king for the rebuilding of this house of God in Jerusalem. And let the king send us his pleasure in this matter." This was exactly the right approach. Instead of making assumptions or guessing what the king would want, Tattenai suggested a thorough investigation of the royal records. He was putting the decision entirely in King Darius's hands. King Darius received Tattenai's letter and faced a decision that could affect the stability of his empire. If the Jews were building illegally, he needed to stop them to maintain order. But if they had legitimate authority from a previous king, stopping them would be an injustice that could cause other problems. Chapter 6, verse 1 records his wise response. "Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in Babylon, in the house of the archives where the documents were stored. The Persian Empire was famous for its detailed record-keeping. Every royal decree, every treaty, every important document was carefully preserved in massive archive buildings. These weren't just filing cabinets. They were enormous libraries containing the administrative history of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The search began in Babylon, the logical place to look for documents from Cyrus's reign. Teams of scribes combed through thousands of scrolls and tablets, looking for any reference to Jerusalem, the Jewish temple, or Cyrus's policy toward the exiled peoples. Day after day, they searched through the carefully organized archives, but the document wasn't found in Babylon. Chapter 6, verse 2, reveals where it was discovered, and in Ecbatana, the citadel that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found on which this was written: a record. Ecbatana was the summer capital of the Persian Empire, located in the mountains where the royal court spent the hot months. The fact that Cyrus's decree was found there suggests it may have been issued during the summer season when the king was at his mountain palace. The scroll that was found contained exactly what the Jews had claimed. Chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, record the original decree. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury, and also let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that is in Jerusalem, each to its place. And you shall put them in the house of God. This was even more than the Jews had claimed. Not only did Cyrus authorize the rebuilding, but he specified the dimensions, ordered that it be funded from the royal treasury, and commanded the return of all the temple treasures. The decree was detailed, specific, and completely legitimate. The discovery vindicated everything the Jewish leaders had told Tattenai. They hadn't been exaggerating or making false claims. If anything, they had been modest in describing the scope of their authorization. Cyrus hadn't just given them permission, he had commanded them to rebuild and promised to pay for it. Finding Cyrus's original decree put King Darius in a clear position. His predecessor had not only authorized the temple construction, but had commanded it and promised to fund it. Any king who ignored or reversed such a decree would be admitting that Persian royal decrees weren't reliable. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, record Darius's response. Now, therefore, Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shetha-Bozenai, and your associates the governors who are in the province beyond the river, keep away from there. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Darius didn't just confirm the original permission, he ordered his officials to stay away from the construction site entirely. The message was clear. Anyone who interfered with this project would be interfering with imperial policy and would face the consequences. But the king went much further than simply restoring the original authorization. Chapter 6, verses 8 through 10 contain his additional commands. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river, and whatever is needed, bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven. Wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests at Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. This was incredible. Not only would the temple be rebuilt, but the Persian government would pay for everything, the construction costs, the daily sacrifices, and all the supplies needed for worship. The empire that had once destroyed Jerusalem was now funding its restoration. Darius even explained his reasoning. He wanted the priests to pray for him and his family. This pagan king understood something important about the power of prayer and wanted the God of Israel on his side. But the decree wasn't finished. Chapter 6, verses 11 and 12 contain a severe warning. Also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this, or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. The punishment for interfering with the temple construction was death, not just any death, but impalement, one of the most brutal execution methods known to the ancient world. And the criminal's house would be destroyed and turned into a garbage dump as a permanent reminder of what happened to those who opposed God's work. Darius even invoked the God of Israel in his curse, asking him to overthrow any king or people who tried to destroy the temple. This foreign king was essentially asking the Jewish God to protect the Jewish temple against future enemies. The response to Darius's decree was immediate and enthusiastic. Chapter 6, verse 13 records, Then, according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shetha-Bozenai, and their associates did with all diligence as Darius the king had ordered. There was no delay, no bureaucratic foot-dragging, no attempts to find loopholes in the king's commands. Tattenai and his fellow governors followed their orders exactly and enthusiastically. The phrase, "with all diligence," suggests they went above and beyond what was required, making sure every detail of the king's decree was fulfilled perfectly. Persian gold began flowing into Jerusalem to fund the construction. Royal suppliers delivered the finest materials. Government officials who had once been obstacles became helpful assistants. The same political system that had stopped the work 15 years earlier was now working overtime to ensure its completion. Chapter 6, verse 14 describes the remarkable progress that followed. And the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes king of Persia. Notice the three sources of authority mentioned: God's decree and the decrees of three different Persian kings. What had started with divine calling was now backed by imperial authority. Heaven and earth were working together to accomplish God's purposes. The prophets continued their ministry throughout the construction process. Haggai and Zechariah didn't just spark the revival, they sustained it. When workers faced difficult challenges, the prophets were there with encouragement. When technical problems arose, they provided spiritual perspective. When opposition attempted to resurface, they reminded everyone of God's promises. Chapter 6, verse 15 records the moment everyone had been waiting for. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. After 21 years of starts and stops, the temple was finally complete. The date was carefully recorded, the 3rd day of Adar, in the 6th year of Darius, which corresponds to March 12/515 BC. This wasn't just the end of a construction project. It was the fulfillment of divine promises and the vindication of persistent faith. The temple that rose from the foundation of tears and joy was smaller than Solomon's original temple, but it was no less precious to God. It represented the faithfulness of people who refused to give up on God's promises, even when those promises seemed impossible to fulfill. With the construction finally complete, it was time for the celebration that had been 21 years in the making. Chapter 6, verse 16 sets the scene. And the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles, celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. This wasn't just a ribbon-cutting ceremony or a formal religious service. This was an explosion of joy that had been building up for over 2 decades. Families who had worked on the foundation as young adults now brought their children to see the completed temple. Elderly people who had wondered if they would live to see this day found themselves dancing with tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. The dedication involved massive sacrifices, as recorded in chapter 6, verse 17. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. These numbers represent an enormous celebration. 100 bulls, 200 rams, and 400 lambs meant that thousands of people would feast together in the presence of God. The 12 goats for the sin offering showed that this dedication included all 12 tribes of Israel, even though only people from Judah and Benjamin had returned from exile. But the celebration wasn't just about food and festivities. Chapter 6, verse 18, records the restoration of the temple's organizational structure. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their courses for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the Book of Moses. This was just as important as the building itself. The temple wasn't just a beautiful structure, it was the center of Israel's worship system. The priests were organized into their ancient divisions, with each group serving during specific weeks throughout the year. The Levites resumed their various responsibilities as singers, musicians, gatekeepers, and assistance. Everything was done as it is written in the Book of Moses, showing their commitment to following God's original instructions rather than making up new traditions. They were restoring not just a building, but an entire system of worship that connected them to their ancestors and to God's covenant promises. The celebration reached its climax with the observance of Passover. As chapter 6, verses 19 through 22 describe, on the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. For the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. This Passover was special in several ways. It was the first one celebrated in the completed temple, making it a true homecoming feast. But notice that it included not just the returned exiles, but also everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land. Some of the local inhabitants had chosen to join the Jewish community and worship the true God. The final verse mentions something remarkable. God had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. This is referring to the Persian king. The text uses Assyria because Persia had conquered the territories once ruled by Assyria. The same empire that had once been their enemy was now their ally, providing funding and protection for God's work. 60 years had passed since the temple's completion. The building was beautiful. The sacrifices were offered daily, but the spiritual heart of the people needed attention. That's when God raised up a remarkable man for a special mission. Chapter 7, verse 1 introduces us to this new leader. Now after this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra the son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Aaron the chief priest. This wasn't just any religious teacher. Ezra's family line traced all the way back to Aaron, the first high priest of Israel. But Ezra had developed skills that went far beyond temple duties. Chapter 7, verse 6 tells us what made Ezra special. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, and the king granted him all that he asked. For the hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. Ezra wasn't just a priest, he was a scribe, an expert in God's written word. While other priests focused on sacrifices and ceremonies, Ezra had spent years studying, copying, and teaching the scriptures. Chapter 7, verse 10 reveals the secret of Ezra's effectiveness. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Notice the order: study, do, then teach. Ezra didn't just learn about God's law, he lived it. Only after experiencing the law personally did he begin teaching it to others. King Artaxerxes didn't just give Ezra permission to travel, he wrote him a letter that gave him almost unlimited authority. Chapter 7, verses 11 and 12 introduce this remarkable document. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a scribe of the words of the commandments of the Lord. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven. Peace. Chapter 7, verse 13 contains the first grant. And now I make a decree that anyone of the people of Israel or their priests or Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. This was an open invitation for any Jewish person in the Persian Empire to join Ezra's mission. It was like a second Exodus, but this time with royal approval and funding. The king's generosity went much further. Chapter 7, verses 19 through 22 explain, The vessels that have been given you for the service of the house of your God, you shall deliver before the God of Jerusalem. And whatever else is required for the house of your God, you may provide it out of the king's treasury. Up to 100 talents of silver, 100 kor of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of oil and salt without prescribing how much. Chapter 7, verse 24 adds another remarkable benefit. We also notify you that it shall not be lawful to impose tribute, custom or toll on any one of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the doorkeepers, the temple servants, or other servants of this house of God. The king completely exempted all Jewish religious personnel from taxation throughout the Persian Empire. Ezra began organizing what would become the Second Exodus. Chapter 8 lists the families who volunteered. 754 men, probably representing about 5,000 people, including women and children. But Ezra discovered a serious problem. Chapter 8, verse 15 describes the crisis. I gathered them to the river that runs to Ahava, and there we encamped 3 days. As I reviewed the people and the priests, I found there none of the sons of Levi. No Levites had volunteered for the journey. This was critical because Levites were essential for proper temple service. Chapter 8, verses 16 and 17 explain Ezra's solution. Then I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, and sent them to Iddo, the leading man at the place Casiphia, telling them what to say to Iddo and his brothers and the temple servants at the place Casiphia, namely, to send us ministers for the house of our God. The mission was successful. Chapter 8, verses 18 through 20 record the results. And by the good hand of our God on us, they brought us a man of discretion. Sherebiah with his sons and kinsmen, 18, also Hashabiah, 20, besides 220 of the temple servants. Now the group was complete with priests, Levites, temple servants, and families. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem was 900 miles through dangerous territory. Persian kings routinely provided military escorts, but Ezra chose a different path. Chapter 8, verse 21 explains his decision. Then I proclaimed a fast there, at the river Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. Chapter 8, verse 22 reveals why. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against the enemy on our way, since we had told the king, the hand of our God is for good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. Ezra had been telling the king about God's power and protection. Now he had to live by his own words. Before leaving, Ezra organized the transport of temple treasures. Chapter 8, verses 25 and 26 describe the staggering amounts. And I weighed out to them the silver and the gold and the vessels. I weighed into their hands 650 talents of silver, and silver vessels worth 200 talents, and 100 talents of gold. Chapter 8. Verse 31 describes the journey's success. Then we departed from the river Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy and from ambushes by the way. After arriving in Jerusalem, Ezra met with local leaders and discovered a shocking problem. Chapter 9, verses 1 and 2 record the devastating report. The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, for they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has been mixed with the peoples of the lands. And in this faithlessness, the hand of the leaders and chief men has been foremost. This wasn't just a casual problem, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The Jewish community had been intermarrying with pagan nations, exactly what God had forbidden. Even worse, the religious and civil leaders were leading in this disobedience. For 60 years since the temple's completion, this problem had been growing. What started as occasional exceptions had become widespread practice, threatening the very identity of God's people. Ezra's reaction was immediate and extreme. Chapter 9, verse 3, describes his response. As soon as I heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak, and pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. This wasn't mild disappointment. This was overwhelming grief. Tearing clothes and pulling out hair showed the depth of his anguish. At evening, Ezra began one of the most powerful prayers in Scripture. Chapter 9, verses 5 and 6 describe how he began, "And at the evening sacrifice I rose from my fasting, with my garment and my cloak torn, and fell upon my knees, and spread out my hands to the Lord my God, saying, O my God, I'm ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God. For our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens." Ezra didn't blame the people. He identified with their guilt, saying, our iniquities and our guilt. Even though he hadn't participated in the intermarriages, he took responsibility as one of God's people. His prayer continued with acknowledgement of God's grace. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God, to leave us a remnant and to give us a secure hold within his holy place. The prayer concluded with a warning in verses 14 and 15. Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant nor any to escape? As Ezra prayed, a crowd gathered. Chapter 10, verse 1 describes the scene. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept very bitterly. Then something unexpected happened. Chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, record a remarkable intervention. And Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, addressed Ezra. We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Shechaniah's proposal was radical: divorce all foreign wives and send away their children. But he argued this drastic action was necessary to restore their covenant relationship with God. Chapter 10, verse 5 records Ezra's response. Then Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel take an oath that they would do as had been said. So they took the oath. Chapter 10, verse 7 shows the seriousness of the reform. And a proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the returned exiles that they should assemble at Jerusalem, and that if anyone did not come within 3 days, by order of the officials and the elders, all his property should be forfeited, and he himself banned from the congregation of the exiles. The response was overwhelming. Chapter 10, verses 9 and 10 describe the scene. Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God. Trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain, thousands of men sat in the rain, knowing their families were about to be torn apart. Ezra's words were direct. You have broken faith and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now then, make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. The people proposed a systematic investigation. Chapter 10, verses 13 and 14 record their request. But the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open. Let our officials stand for the whole assembly. Let all in our cities who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times. Chapter 10, verse 16 records the beginning. Then the returned exiles did so. Ezra the priest selected men, heads of fathers' houses. On the first day of the 10th month, they sat down to examine the matter. The investigation lasted 3 months. Chapter 10, verses 18 through 44, provide the complete list. 113 men from various families who were required to divorce their foreign wives. The book ends abruptly. All these had married foreign women, and some of the women had even borne children. If this story opened your eyes to see the Book of Ezra in a completely new way, hit that subscribe button right now. We're just getting started with these deep dives into biblical books that will change how you read your Bible forever. And here's what I want you to do next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that God specializes in impossible comebacks. Whether they're facing opposition, dealing with setbacks, or wondering if their dreams are dead, Ezra's story proves that God can turn any situation around. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of Ezra's story hit you the hardest? Was it the foundation ceremony with tears and joy, the 15 years of waiting, or Ezra's painful reforms? I read every single comment. Don't forget to ring that notification bell, because next week we're diving into another biblical book like you've never seen before. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, your story isn't over yet.